Alrighty. So first of all, I want you to know that there's another video for chapter 5, and it is also covering things. This is just mainly just the timeline of chapter 5. The other video will cover causes and effects and those sort of events as well. But the entirety of chapter 5 is basically causes and effects, but there are certain things where Britain will do something and then America will respond. So, right now we're talking about chapter 5, the causes of the revolution. In 1763, the proclamation line limits white settlement, and it stopped whites from moving into the native Appalachian Mountains. In 1764, the Sugar Act and Currency Act are passed by George Grenville, who was the prime minister, and the Currency Act banned American colonies from using paper money as legal tender. And they had to start using British money or coins. The Sugar Act lowered the price of molasses, and even though, but this angered New England smugglers because the price was dropping and it was ruining their business. And there was also colonists also opposed the Vice Admiralty courts because they would not acquit merchants. In 1765, the Stamp Act imposes a direct tax. And it taxed all printed items. In the next one that comes up is the Quartering Act, which required barracks for British troops. So in your house, you would have to be okay with allowing a British to stay in your farmhouses. The Stamp Act, Congress also meets and acts and petitions for the repeal of the Stamp Act, which was imposing a tax on paint, paper, glass, etc. Americans boycott British goods due to the Stamp Act, and they started to be motivated by the Great Awakening and new notions of liberty. In 1766, the first compromise was a compromise on the Stamp Act because it was repealed, and this is the first compromise that you'll see throughout this timeline, but there are a couple more. But even though they repealed the Stamp Act, they still declare that Parliament has full power and authority over the colonies through the Declaratory Act. In 1767, the Townsend duties, which are the Townsend Act of 1767 and the Revenue Act of 1767, put duties on paper, glass, paint, and tea. And it also creates a Board of Customs and adds more Vice Admiralty courts that I mentioned before, which have judges appointed by the British. And they add them in different areas, like different cities and different states. In 1768, the second American boycott starts the Daughters of Liberty, and which are women who create textiles and other items that are household items and things you generally need to be able to help Americans get the British to change their laws and even try to separate from Britain. This also causes the growth of domestic industry. And, let's go to yellow, in 1770, the second compromise was the partial repeal of the Townsend Acts. The thing that they kept, to show their supremacy, they kept the tax on tea, and Lord North was the one who persuaded the partial repeal of the Townsend Act. The Townsend Acts also caused the Boston Massacre, which had British troops firing into a crowd, and it killed 5 people, all townsfolk who were throwing rocks at them. In 1772, the Committees of Correspondence formed to be able to organize boycotting and generally make laws for themselves and separate themselves slightly from Britain. In 1773, the Tea Act, it lowers the price of tea to be able to stop smugglers, but this causes the Boston Tea Party, which is Americans dressing up as natives and throwing tea into the ocean. And next we have in 1774, the Coercive Acts are supposed to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. And Dunmore's war is Lord Dunmore fighting against the Ohio Shawnees to be able to take over Connecticut. The First Continental Congress also meets during this time period. This also has the Third American Boycott, which is organized by the Continental Congress, and Parliament needed to repeal the Coercive Acts by September 1775 if they wanted the Third American Boycott to not happen. And next we have in 1775, General Gage marches on to Lexington and Concord. And this is the Battle of Lexington and Concord, obviously. The Second Continental Congress creates the Continental Army. There's also Lord Dunmore recruiting loyalist slaves through the Dunmore Proclamation, which promised them freedom if they fight for the British. Next, we have Patriots invade Canada, and there's a skirmish with loyalists in the south. Western settlers occupied Kentucky, and after the takeover of Kentucky, after Dunmore's war, and Virginia allowed Kentucky to be separate instead of, because Lord Dunmore was a royal governor in Virginia, and they were like, you know what, Kentucky, you can be separate, but I did take you over. And they gave them arms because they were quite liberalist. Next we'll do purple. Thomas Paine's Common Sense explains why Americans should fight in the war. And the Declaration of Independence in July 4th, 1776 was made by Thomas Jefferson and many others in the Continental Congress, and was inspired by natural rights and the social contract theory of John Locke. And if you want an explanation on that, look at the other video. Alrighty, thank you so much.